Okay, so I had a chance to watch the reveal stream yesterday, and one of the things I didn't hear much mention about this is that we're about to see massive changes to monster resistances. And even though that means that none of the player balance changed, the content we're facing is going to be significantly different depending on what kind of build you play. So for instance, elemental damage over time builds care a lot about monster resistances. And being able to bring them down is a lot of investment, right? Because elemental penetration is off the table. And what that means is that even though, from an equation perspective, we have a relatively, one side of the equation stayed the same, the other side of the equation did not. The monsters are going to change drastically, both in their abilities, but the thing I'm most interested in is in their resistances. Because one of the things that happened with the way things were set up before is that if something was resistant to elements, it was usually resistant to all elements. Right, so let's take a look at a monster. This is a heist monster. You can see it starts with 37 resistance for fire, cold, and lightning. That's pretty high for a monster. Usually monsters have like 40 or 75 total resistances. This one has a lot more, but they're balanced. They're only like 37 apiece. But when there's rares, rares had auras, and all auras are going away for rares. So what does that look like? Well, a resist aura was 35 additional resistance to everything. Right, so if we look at our monster, now we are at 72 elemental resistance. But that was just the mod on the resistance. This is a prefix, this is a prefix. You could also have resistances on the suffix, right? And that was 40%. So now you're at 112 resistance to everything. Well, 112 resistance to everything means that if you're penetrating, you're going to have to go through everything above 75, right? And then you get to stuff underneath it. If you're using curses, I mean, the resist capped even for elemental weakness, unless you have some pretty fancy curses going. So it was actually shockingly difficult to be able to bring down resistances on occasion. And this was an issue when your rares would stack up. If there were too many rares going on at the same time, you would put yourself in a position where the auras started overlapping and you just had a really hard time managing that. So cold dot builds, fire dot builds, both of those receive a lot of benefits from this. Even chaos dot builds. Right, you could have 40% chaos resistance, and I believe there's an aura that provides chaos resistance as well. Not sure if it is added to the site, but it was added like a last release, I believe, or the release before. So you're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how am I going to mitigate resistances, because if you're playing like a fire build and you're doing ignite, fire damage over time, whichever flavor you want, then it wasn't really an option to say like, okay, well, I also have some lightning damage, so that when something is very resistant to fire, I can just switch over to lightning and handle it that way. Because all of these mods would do all elemental resistances. Right, and this is not a very long list. Right, there's like, what, 20 things on this list? And some of them are exceedingly rare. The same thing over here, there's even less of them. And Welt, as far as I can tell, shouldn't even be on this list because I don't think I've ever encountered it. So the odds of you encountering a monster with this combination was just really high. Right? Like resist elemental damage and an aura of resist elemental damage. We're not talking about that being a super uncommon scenario to hit. It was more something that you were seeing like half the time once you were at maps, just because you had like 4 or 5 mods on monsters, right? Maybe 6 mods on monsters. Well, that just means that the odds of hitting these things is just very high. Plus they're weighted as well. And I believe that the elemental resistance was pretty heavily weighted. Okay, so what changes? Well, these mods are gone. No more auras, no more aura stacking. Right? This makes a big difference for heist, because when you run into a room and you stare at all the auras overlapping and you're like, oh, I better kill everything right away, because otherwise the auras are going to get me. Like there you can just get some really silly combinations. And for elemental damage over time builds, that was a really big deal. For some elemental damage build, that was a big deal. Right? If you had too many overlapping auras and you didn't have enough penetration, you were not running omniscience or something, then that was a big problem to deal with. And of course it could go much higher, right? We're not including like map modifiers or like endurance charges, because endurance charges can give you another 45 resist. So monsters could scale their effective resist. You know, yeah, they're capped at 75, but their actual resist could be well north of 150. So that means that penetration was just hard to do. And by penetration on the tree felt kind of underwhelming, right? Because sometimes you're just hitting monsters where, even though you had some level of penetration, you didn't bring the resist low enough to actually make a difference. And like curses, when you had to use curses to do things, you see a lot of people focusing on the occultist, because you can get through hexproof, you have 2 curses, which means elemental weakness, plus whatever element you're dealing with. So how is all this changing? Well, now we have mods like Flameweaver. Right? Flameweaver is one of the Arch Nemesis mods. They are far more impactful in the actual gameplay, but the most interesting thing is this. It sets the base fire damage resistance. It's not a plus modifier, right? Just sets it to 75%. Okay, so we have a 75% fire resistance, which means that if you have some level of penetration, it's going to be effective. If you have a curse, it's going to be effective. Monsters are going to have a very hard time overcapping their resistances now, because the only way they can get there is endurance charges or map mods. And then still, it's fire resistance, right? It's not all elements. I'm sure Evocationists probably has some here. This one sets all elemental resistances to 75%. Right? And all damage can freeze, shock, ignite, always freezes, ignites, and shock. I don't think we're going to be running into this particular scenario very often, the Evocationist or the empowered elements. And these are probably not super common mods. We're probably going to see a lot of Flameweavers, Frostweavers, and Stormweavers. But all of these, if you have multiple elements of damage you do, you almost don't even need a lot of penetration to deal with them, because your other elements can help carry you. So the way that monster resistances are working is going to be a massive change compared to the way things were before. And what that means is that if you're playing like a cold dot build, right? Cold dot builds had a reputation for being shit for mapping. I've played some cold dot Pathfinders. I'll probably play cold dot Pathfinder next league. And that's true. They're really good in the Azure Mines. But when it comes to actual mapping, it was clunky, right? You're dropping stuff at your feet. You're running at packs directly, means you just get blown up. Things are going to be chasing you all the time. It's just not great. So one of the ways that Pathfinder can go cold dot is for Pathfinder it's relatively easy to slap in on Righteous Fire, because your recovery can be bonkers. Well, now you have a fire component and a cold component. In the past, that really wasn't very meaningful. Now, it could be, right? Because you can say like, hey, if I'm dealing with a mob which resists cold, my Righteous Fire might actually do pretty close to full damage to it and be a much more meaningful component. If you are using like some lightning skills to trigger elemental equilibrium, then that could again mean that, hey, I have now a lightning component, a fire component, and a cold component. And it isn't just that like one common mod or a relatively common two mod combination completely shuts down my character. Right? Because now what it means is that you're like, okay, well, if you have 75 resist cold, the chance of you also having 75 resist lightning and fire are relatively low. And if I have enough penetration on one of those to deal with high resist, then I'm probably still in a pretty good spot. Right? So if I say my hits are lightning, I have lightning penetration on that skill, and that procs my elemental equilibrium, then that means that the most cold resist and the most fire resist I really should expect is about 50. Unless there's endurance charges or map mods. If I then add like a elemental weakness curse to the mix, I mean, then the most resist I really should be expecting is like 20. And in the past you had scenarios like this, right? That's why people liked Cold Dot for bossing. You had high uptime on your damage, and when you're bossing, it's very predictable what you're facing, right? You can do the math as to how much damage per second you do to a boss. That's why people are always like, hey, this is my damage against Cyrus, whatever. Or don't. And then the numbers look better. But what the problem often wasn't that. It was like, hey, there were too many rares, bad mods combined together. Now the resists are through the roof, and I have a really hard time killing things. Which, you know, if you've played the mines had a bit of a like an infinite delve. You sometimes just ran into those scenarios where you just stared at it and you're like, I can't drop these mobs fast enough because, you know, the elemental resists are stacking too high. So yeah, this change is awesome. This change makes a whole bunch of builds viable that were not viable before, right? Because if you were not speccing pretty heavily into penetration, you were going to have a really hard time with some of these mods when they were encountered and you didn't have enough clear speed. Now, if you're playing a build that just blew up everything before it showed up on the screen, this doesn't matter, right? There were never enough rares around to really impact you. But for certain builds that don't have a very large range at which they're effective, RF, Cold Dot, right? Builds that kind of sucked enemies in. This is a huge change, and this could open up some very interesting builds, and some builds that really were not practical to play in the past are now actually pretty nice. Because yes, you can still hit the case where a monster's base elemental resists are 75%. But in that case, you're having like empowered elements or evocationist. That is pretty rare to hit, I assume. I'm pretty sure people will bitch to high heaven if it's not. But what is far more interesting is that the odds of hitting monsters that have more than 75 resists is gone through the floor. Whereas before, it was very easy to run into a guard captain with 37 base and then get 75 bonus, and they're in the hundreds. Like, and that's, I think, part of the reason why people really, really disliked Heist. Is because if you were playing certain builds and you had a bad combination of auras and the defensive auras stacked up, you were in trouble. And that's no longer the case. Right? And one of the things that people thought it did in the past, right? You had to convert all your physical damage to elemental damage because your physical damage was pretty much thrown away otherwise. That's no longer the case either. Right? Because if you're looking at it from the modifier perspective, yeah, you have Steel Infused. Steel Infused gives you physical damage plus 50%, whereas the I don't know how to read this. It makes you more resistant to physical damage, so there must be some amount of damage reduction. Not entirely sure how that part works with this language, but the chance of you running into something that's steel infused and have Chaos Weaver or something else is pretty low. And because that combination is low, now splitting your damage into two categories, because we can scale our damage pretty high, and because we don't have auras to worry about which can negate large chunks of our damage, and there's not many mods that negate multiple sources of damage, we now have a potential to build in a very different way than we could before. We don't have to invest as heavily in elemental penetration. We don't have to invest as heavily in curses. We don't have to invest as heavily in dealing with hexproof and all the other bullshit, because now we have an opportunity to say, like, okay, if I have 30 penetration total on my build, right, and I have a way to deal with charges, which before wasn't really something you'd ever worry about, then I know the maximum resist I'm ever going to have to face is 45%. Right? And if it's a map that has more, then I just don't run that map or re-roll it. You couldn't say that before. And I think that this really opens up a lot of interesting elemental builds. And I'm kind of excited for it. Like, initially I was really hoping for a bunch of changes, but the changes are not on the player side of the equation. It's the monster side of the equation. That's very different. The monsters are going to be far more engaging, for better and worse. Right? There's going to be some pretty obnoxious monsters that when you played Arch Nemesis, you just saw them chained up and you're like, yeah, I'm good. One of those cage skeletons, I'm good. I'll take the next one. And now it's like, oh, no, you don't get to pick anymore. Right? It can be one of those that has all the magical stuff going on. You can have a guy who casts Discharge and can actually get a reasonable amount of charges going, which is going to be very exciting and interesting and absolutely terrifying. I think it's going to be very interesting. I think that there's going to be, you know, for the people playing hardcore, probably going to be a bit of a rough league. There's going to be some things you encounter where you're like, okay, well, there's no way I can deal with this scenario. And people are going to have to adjust their speeds to not die as often. Which again means that there's builds which had a lack of speed but had benefits in survivability or damage uptime and being able to negate things. They get a boost. So yeah, 3.18. Pretty excited. I'm still looking at the same tree as before. I'm gonna go for the agnostic. Going to run a vortex. Going to run a cast on crit with static strike, and probably mana bond. And then probably run a righteous fire on top of it, so I can use righteous fire with the agnostic and Mind Over Matter to get rid of all of my mana. Then I use the Laviana Spirit to regain mana and make all my skills free. And then I have Vortex on the right click because, you know, I'm scaling elemental damage and I'm scaling duration already, and that makes life easy. This is more the leveling tree where I'm going to go attack based, Winter Spirit, Trinity. Trinity is also going to be so much nicer because you're not going to have to worry about as much penetration anymore. Like Wild Strike, Elemental Hit, both of those skills got a big boost out of this too. Right? Like anything that does mixed damage sources really got a big boost from this. If you're just elemental damage stacking onto a bow build, it's a pretty good boost. Sure, a monster may negate like one of your elements, but you still got the other two, and some physical tossed in there as well. So yeah, I'm kind of excited as to what builds this opens up. I think it is far more impactful than people give it credit for. I think that people are gonna have, if you're playing EA Ballistas, this could be really rough, right? Because it's probably gonna be a pretty common mod that a monster just has a flat 75% fire resist. That's bad. That's bad if you play that. Because if we go to Evocationist, Flame Weaver, it's base fire damage resistance 75%. It inflicts fire exposure and cannot be scorched. Aw. But it can still be ignited, so it's not too bad. But yeah, I think that, you know, the Frost Weaver, Flame Weaver, Storm Weaver gonna be super common, similar to the way that they dropped. And we're gonna have a pretty exciting time. You know, and then Flame Striders, like the combinations, probably gonna be less popular, less common. Looks like there's no immune to ignite. It always ignites. 200% ignite damage. That's exciting. Yeah, some of these combinations are going to be pretty brutal. I don't know if we're going to see these top level ones, like Aberrant Touched. I assume we won't. Yeah, the monster modifiers are actually significantly lighter than some of the other modifications. So we'll see what it looks like. I'm excited. I'm really happy that the auras are gone from monsters. I really think it changes what playstyles are possible. I really think it opens up a lot of builds. And I think that this is, I mean, the change on the monster side, just from a resist perspective, this has a massive impact on all elemental skills. And the fact that monsters are going to have far more meaningful abilities probably affects people's playstyles pretty massively. Going with a bad build or like some random ass experiment, which I'm gonna do anyway, into a league where the rare monsters are gonna be far more impactful, far more meaningful. I mean, you could have, of course, a magic pack of bombardiers or whatever. You're going to have to be a bit more respectful and pay attention to mods and understand when you are getting to the point where, like, okay, certain combinations can kill me. You're gonna have to watch out for it and play more on your toes. Probably not great if you're planning on, you know, grinding for hours on end. But if you don't get to do it anyway because you have a baby or something like that, then this means that the little bit of time you get to play is going to be more exciting, more fun, and yeah, looking forward to it.